If you thought the power struggle in Game of Thrones was messy, wait until you see what the Calgary Flames are working on.
Your Locked On Flames, your daily podcast on the Calgary Flames. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Locked On Flames, presented by Gametime, the best app for buying tickets. It is your host, Nick Zararis, here to discuss all things Calgary Flames, because the Flames are the center of all of the inside baseball intrigue as of the moment. So on today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about the macro level, what's the plan, the vetting process for who the new general manager may or may not be, and then what that decision will ultimately signal towards the future, who they hire and what that would mean going forward. I want to thank everyone for hanging out, making Locked On Flames your first listen of the day. We are Locked On Flames, your team every day. Okay. It's not often that the Calgary Flames are the center of the NHL media nexus. You got to remember, so much, the running joke, of course, is how does this affect the Leafs? That's because so much of hockey media in Canada is centralized in Ontario. It is centralized around the Leafs and the money making that is Toronto, the money making machine that is Toronto Maple Leafs hockey. When you are one of the other Canadian teams and you aren't in the playoffs, if you're not in the lottery, you are probably going to end up getting thrown on the back burner unless you have specific things going on. One of those very specific things is a power struggle, which is very clearly underway in Calgary, is the way I will describe it. So you have a relatively aloof owner in Murray Edwards who, will occasionally chime in, but for the most part isn't very around, isn't very present. He's got a coach in Darryl Sutter who he personally brought back out of, you won't say retirement because Darryl Sutter technically had a job title with another NHL organization when the Flames hired him, but he was a consultant. He wasn't in the office day to day. That is what brought Darryl back into the game. You have an interim general manager right now in Don Maloney, and I got to make sure to remember to myself, Don, not Dan. Dan Maloney. Dan Maloney is Don Maloney's brother. Dan Maloney is a very present force in Ranger fans' lives. He does a lot of TV and radio stuff for the organization. But yeah, Don Maloney in charge of the current situation. And one of the news tidbits I found while I was doing show prep today that I found interesting is that Maloney said he is supposed to sit down with Darryl Sutter and they are going to talk about what players said during the exit interviews. That answers the first question I had going back to as soon as they announced last week that Brad was not coming back. Who's conducting the exit interviews? Because when you have a season that doesn't go as planned, you need to get as much feedback as you possibly can. And it's not going to be good. Just being frank with you, when you are going to get a lot of feedback from a group that underperformed for the most part, you had a few guys who had nice years. Tyler Toffoli, I'm sure, only has nice things to say about Darryl Sutter. He had a career year. But the guys who struggled this year, guys who came in from other organizations like Huberdeau, who have been outward about their own struggles, guys like Markstrom, who did not play up to his ability. You got to get to the root of what caused those struggles. And sure, some of that is just the variance of hockey and, it didn't go our way, whatever. But at some fundamental level, you need to get a better understanding of the intangible, which is, of course, an oxymoron. The intangible, you can't quantify, you can't evaluate. You need to get feedback. You need to get anecdotes. You need the primary source. I was trying to think of the word. You need the primary source of the people who were there. Tell me what didn't work for you. So now that we know that the exit interviews are underway and Maloney has been working on them, he's going to have to sit down with Darryl Sutter, and they're going to go over whatever the major takeaways were. So that brings me to the big question. And I asked this question last week when I was on Thursday and on Friday. What is the plan? It's that simple. What is the plan? Is this just simply a re-rack, change the general manager, maybe swap out a bottom six forward, a sixth defenseman, maybe say we're going to buy out Markstrom and just re-rack the same group? If that's the goal, that tells you the owner, the coach, and whoever the new GM is are not particularly interested in going on a rebuild. And Murray Edwards, an older gentleman. Darryl Sutter, an older gentleman. That, and this is something I'm going to talk about a little later in the second segment of today's show, that would lead me to wanting a younger executive. That doesn't necessarily mean somebody getting their first crack at being an NHL GM, but somebody who's a little bit on the younger side, maybe comes from a newer school of hockey thinking, to give the Flames a little bit more of diversity of thought. You figure Brad's been there almost 10 seasons. Darryl's been in hockey since I think Dwight Eisenhower was president, but that might be a little bit of hyperbole. It might be more like since like JFK was president, but I digress. Do you want to go for a Stanley Cup, or do you want to set your team up for a multiple year window? That is the question. If you are going for the Stanley Cup next year, you need to address how can you get more out of Huberdeau? How can you get more out of Kadri? How can you make sure Rieger hits the ground running? How can you make sure Jacob Markstrom and Dustin Wolf or Dan Vladar, whichever two of those three goalies, how can you make sure that you're going to have at least league average goaltending behind what was an underperforming team last year? How are you going to ensure that to happen? So when you think about it this way, and I've said this a lot, and it bears worth repeating because of the type of team the Flames are, where they've made the playoffs half of the time under Brad as GM, what is your goal? Do you just want to make the playoffs, get that guaranteed revenue of 2 extra home games, and whatever happens beyond that, if you've got a good team, great? Or are you in this to genuinely try and win a championship? And that's hard for some people to accept. Those do not always concurrently line up. Sure, maybe when Brad assembled the roster last summer, when Darryl showed up for training camp, the owner signed off on the checks for the team. Everybody looked at it and said, yeah, this team can contend for a Stanley Cup. I was one of those people. I thought the Flames would be right there in the Western Conference this year, and it did not manifest. So, because it didn't manifest, I think it's hard to justify re-racking the same group, running it back, and saying, all we need is slightly different vibes, and things are going to dramatically change. Sure, better vibes, a little bit better luck, that will make a difference, and the Flames... It will make a difference for the Flames if they just get a little bit better luck. All the one-goal losses probably won't happen again, but I won't speak authoritatively on that because hockey's a dumb game sometimes. So, the real question that sets up our second segment of today's show, which the second segment is titled The Vetting Process. The question I have, and this is very straightforward. If you bring in a new GM and Darryl still is doing his stubborn my way or the highway thing, how are you supposed to pitch that to somebody coming from outside of the organization to take the job? If you bring in somebody in here in their late 40s or early 50s who's maybe been assistant GM for a while, maybe I've seen Jason Botterill, who I would stay away from. Buffalo was an utter disaster under his tenure as general manager there, but somebody like that who's looking for their second chance, or somebody like maybe Craig Conroy or Eric Tulsky who are looking for their first real chance, how are you supposed to sell that to them, that they're going to have a coach who's very stubborn, that may or may not have forced your predecessor, Brad Treliving, out of the job? How are you supposed to sell that to somebody who hasn't been here before? Now, Conroy's a little bit different because he's with the organization in an assistant general manager capacity. He's been with the Flames. He's worked with Darryl directly. That's a little bit different. But for some of the guys outside the organization, it's going to be a really tough sell to come in and say, hey, you're going to be able to put your own stamp on this team, when the coach is very clearly the largest figure in the organization. And there was conjecture earlier in this season that maybe Darryl would just step upstairs and they would bring in, and Darryl would pick the new coach, because that's how much the Flames trust and value what Darryl brings to their organization. But before we get to talking about our vetting process, we have got to talk about our friends at Gametime. So, you, like most people, like doing things, don't you? It is hard to find tickets that are not going to break the bank. You see, I'm wearing an Angels hat. I have an Ohtani jersey over my shoulder over there. I am going to the Yankees-Angels game tonight to see Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout play some baseball. I am very excited to do that. I did it using Gametime because buying tickets to your favorite event shouldn't be stressful. Gametime is the fast and easiest way to buy tickets for all sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and get hyped about the game. What are some things I like about the experience? The last-minute tickets. I am a person who flies by the seat of their pants when it comes to making plans. I want to go to a game. I might not buy the tickets till 10 minutes before the game starts because I am looking for the best possible deal. Forget planning in advance. Right up until game time, you can find a great deal on Game Time. Get exclusive flash deals for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. The Game Time guarantee means you will always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Yeah, I am very excited. I know Ohtani hit a home run last night, so probably won't get to see another bomb tonight. But anytime you can see greatness like that in person, you gotta go. You gotta go pay your respects. Go see greatness whenever you can. Game Time, great tool to make that happen. So I titled this segment "The Vetting Process," and I think that might not been the best name possible because I'm not in charge of setting the criteria, because ultimately it's going to fall on what Maloney, Edwards, and Darryl end up deciding to do, because I do think Darryl is going to have input on the general manager selection process, because you need alignment between those two. If your GM and your coach are not on the same wavelength in terms of philosophy and direction is the word I'll use. Direction meaning of the team, you are going to have a difficult time. You saw it this year. Darryl managing every game like it was game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, quicks hooks, riding guys into the ground, benching guys for no real reason. All of the kind of the short bench, the knee jerk. Yeah, there we go. Words are hard sometimes. I've only had like 2 sips of coffee since I started recording this episode, but the knee-jerk reactions of Darryl are very rooted in my way works. I've won the championships. You guys need to listen to me if you want to be like me. So if Darryl is going to have a say in the hiring process for who the general manager is going to be, that's going to limit your pool. You are going to have general managers who want to come in and pick the head coach they work with. There are some situations where that will be feasible. Based on how the Leafs-Lightning game went last night, the Leafs very well may be in a situation where they will hire the GM and then the coach, because the GM wants somebody he can collaborate with. So if you are set on Darryl being your guy, that's going to knock some candidates out of the pool. So you have to find guys who are going to want to work with Darryl as the coach and be open to mortgaging the future and making the job down the road more difficult, because Darryl and the owner are not going to sign up for a down year. Those are 2 guys who, you only get so many rotations around the sun. They want to keep going for it as many times as they can. They are not going to want to spend a season in limbo again like this. They may double down, triple down, quadruple down on this group the next year or 2, because you're not going to be able to sell them on a rebuild or even a retooling process, where even if you only took 1 year off, where you said, we're going to trade some expiring contracts, we're going to bring in some players, not picks, we're going to bring in younger players who need bigger opportunities, more minutes to kind of fully flesh out who they are as professionals, you're not going to get Darryl to sign up for that. Darryl's not a development guy. We're trying to win the Stanley Cup. He's going to fine tune our systems, and we're going to play a very, very structured style of hockey that's going to wear the other team down, and over the course of an 82-game season is going to win you a lot of hockey games. So for me, the Flames need somebody with a fresh perspective. And what I mean by that is somebody who's going to be able to work with Darryl, because Darryl's a non-negotiable, basically. You're with him no matter what. You need somebody who's going to be able to work with Darryl, but is also from a newer school of hockey, because Darryl only has 2 more years left on his contract, and this GM more than likely will be here longer than those 2 seasons. The average general manager lifespan in the NHL is 5.5 seasons. So you usually get 2 coaches as a GM before you get fired if it doesn't go well for you. For the Flames, you need a younger guy who's going to be able to work on the cutting edge here. You think about some of the transactions the Flames have conducted. They've done okay for the most part in getting value where they could. They did the James Neal for Milan Lucic to get one less year of money tied up. Not great, but you had to get rid of that James Neal contract. You think about getting Mackenzie Weegar and Jonathan Huberdeau for Matthew Tkachuk. There's a world in which the Flames go for picks and prospects and say, hey, we're going to take this year, as in the regular season that just concluded, as our retooling year. And then maybe the Flames look like they're in a better position going into this summer as opposed to where they are now. So I personally would like to see the Flames give somebody their first crack at being an NHL GM. I don't think that's going to happen because I think the Flames are going to want to keep going for it, and that typically would lend itself to somebody who may not be the most steadfast in their evaluations is the way I would describe it. So think about the stuff you got to do, the hoops you got to jump through to get a job, the interview process, the image you have to convey and portray yourself, that type of thing. You are going to weed out a lot of the newer school guys who are going to want to put their thumbprint. They're going to want their stamp on the organization. They're not going to sign up for, hey, well, we still got this coach and he's going to be here for the next 2 years. And we want you to keep going for Stanley Cups, even though our team is maybe a second round exit at best if everybody's playing to their absolute maximum potential. That's a tough sell to some of these guys who have never had their own seat before. And I know the counterpoint to that is, well, if they've never had their own seat before, maybe they'd be willing to do. You would not leave a well-situated job. Like Eric Tulsky in Carolina, he's got a good setup right now where he's basically doing the transactional stuff and Waddell, the GM, is more the business end of things. That's a pretty good situation in Carolina. Sure, the owner's a little cheap and they haven't shopped at the top of the market in free agency or in trades, but generally, that is a pretty good job. You've got job security. Your team has won the division multiple years in a row. You've got a really solid core of players there. And you think if everything breaks right for me, I can get this seat here when the time comes as opposed to having to leave to get it. That brings us to Craig Conroy, who a lot of people have chalked up as the presumptive. I've seen more than one clip on social media saying that, hey, if they're not going to give him the job now, he's probably going to leave anyway. Well, that may be true, but you still got to do a full hiring process here. You need to talk to as many people as possible because even if you don't hire them, you might be able to steal some ideas. If you sit down with Tulsky from Carolina and you say, well, you guys have targeted this type of player. What are you looking for in them? And that would make sense because Carolina and Calgary play a similar style of hockey. That is the value of bringing in guys from outside, even if it's just for interviews, is you can get a better understanding of what's going on in other organizations and you can crib note some ideas. You can get some good ideas that you may have not thought of or people in your organization were not familiar with. That's the beauty of bringing in people, even if it's just for interviews. You can set up a very simple challenge. You can say, hey, Eric, we know we only have Lindholm here for one more season. Do you think we should make every effort to bring him back, or would you want to try and get assets for him and reset our franchise? Even if you don't follow up on that, you can get other people's ideas. That is what a successful hiring process in the sports landscape looks like. Sports is a copycat league. Sports is a copycat entity, I should say. When you see teams doing something successfully, they are very inclined to get it stolen by other teams because there are only so many ideas. When you have refined ideas of your own, you want to protect them as best you can. You lose that institutional knowledge when people leave your organization, and that's why you need a fully fleshed out hiring process where even if you're pretty set on hiring Craig Conroy to be the new general manager, you should talk to as many candidates as you possibly can and say, hey, Craig, we like you for this job, but we got to do our due diligence here. We want to talk to as many people as possible. So that way, even if we end up with you, we have some other ideas we might be able to incorporate to what you want to do. Okay, before we move on to the last segment and talk about the future, wanted to touch on the fact that the Flames do not seek a lot of input from outside, meaning everything is very siloed. You saw this breakdown happen over the course of this past season, where you heard the rumors of Darryl going behind Brad's back to talk to the owner directly. That's not healthy. The coach needs to talk to the GM needs to talk to the president needs to talk to the owner. When you have the pre-existing relationships, that muddies the waters and makes communicating more complicated, and it leads to problems like you had this past season. Once again, I want to thank everyone for hanging out today. Make sure you are making Locked On Flames your first listen of the day. So the last segment I wanted to touch on here is what the respective decision might make about what that potential decision means going forward. So you've heard me talk a little bit in this vetting process about bringing in as many candidates as possible, stealing some ideas, being open to new ideas. So if they bring in somebody who's wet behind the ears, the expression old people love to use, if somebody is wet behind the ears, what does that mean? Number one, it means more than likely this person has determined that A, I'm only getting this job if I can work with Darryl, so I'm going to suck it up for the 2 years he's here. Or B, and this would be my hope, is that he is empowered to make the decision on the coach himself. I would like to say, this is what I would do if I were taking that job. I don't mind working with Darryl. We will communicate, we will collaborate, we will make this work for now. But if we are 30 games into next season and we are still struggling, the team is still inconsistent, I want to be able to say, hey, Darryl, this isn't working. I need to bring in somebody better for this job right now. And that's part of the conundrum here. Coaches are very much time dependent. They're time sensitive. Somebody who's a good coach for a team a year or two ago, like when Darryl was brought in, it made sense. Underperforming team, veterans, needed a kick in the butt. You bring in the authoritarian Hardo, who's going to be a little bit miserable and ornery, but he's going to get more out of the guys. Now, Flames are a little bit fragile. They're a little bit delicate. They need somebody who's kind of going to say, hey, man, it's okay, as opposed to, hey, do better. That's kind of where I'm at on the idea of coaches, because coaches are very time sensitive. Most of the time, coaches get 3 cracks at it. If you make the playoffs, you get 4 or 5 cracks at it. But generally speaking, average NHL coach 3.5 seasons, if that. That's what the general contract is usually, and the NHL coaches will sign 3-year deals. So if you can get the most out of that group, okay. But if we're in December and, the Flames are 12th in the West, for example, I would want the authority to say, hey, Darryl, go to the farm. We'll take care of your money. Don't worry. But we need to change the direction of the team because this is not working. You need these two lined up. The GM and coach need to be like this for success to be possible. For me, the alignment of success would be rooted in getting players who are a little bit more speed and smaller, who have more speed and are smaller, because the Flames are a little bit big, they're a little bit slow, and that's Darryl's Achilles heel, is he values the big guys a little bit too much in today's NHL. In today's NHL, those guys are limited in what they can offer you, especially considering you're only going to play them 11, 12 minutes a game. They're not going to have that same impact they would have, say, 10 years ago when they were playing. When Milan Lucic was a top 6 forward for the Bruins, he had a much bigger impact on the game than he does now. But that's one of Darryl's vices. As a GM, you need to set up the roster to be played in the way you want it to be played. Everybody knows the scene in Moneyball where they're talking about Scott Heidelberg and Carlos Pena to play first base. Heidelberg can't play first base. I want Pena. So what does Billy Beane do? He trades Pena, so the A's have to play Scott Heidelberg at first base. That would be the GM saying, hey, I know you like Milan Lucic, coach. He's not coming back. That spot is for Adam Ruzicka. That's it. End of discussion. Now that is how you end up in a power struggle, is coming in and setting the tempo. I think that's the way to go because the Flames are not going to get the Flames don't have the room to take on significant salary. You know all that cap space everybody's been counting and banking on for when Lucic's contract expires? Well, yeah, I went to Huberdeau Kadri. So now, where we sit at the present, you got to ask yourself, what do you hope to achieve? You're taking this job, you and Darryl are at the hip. What can you do with what's here? Because there is not salary to bring on significant players from outside the organization. If you wanted to trade Noah Hannafin or Elias Lindholm for assets to come back, okay, that's a discussion. But if you are just going to re-rack the team that just finished, the last team out, or the first team out in the West, that brings you, that's a hard sell. It's a really hard sell to tell a fan base that really just went through this tumultuous season that, hey, we're going to do the exact same thing, but there's going to be a new general manager. Okay, well, what's stopping Darryl from going behind his back and talking to the owner again? Exactly. Okay, that will just about do it for today's episode of Locked On Flames. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts, available on all the major podcasting platforms, video as well on YouTube. Make sure you are making Locked On Flames your first listen of the day, and check out the wide swath of Locked On content. The NHL playoffs are on fire. The Leafs and Lightning played an absolute stinker last night. The Hurricanes and Islanders might set the sport of hockey back 20 years tonight. All these things are so exciting. Make sure you are tuned in. We will be back tomorrow. Till then, I'll see you guys.